better, although the journals again may have some limits on that, particularly the print journals. So to save yourself a lot of time, and we'll come to that in the second section, but in your preparation you really do have to know which journal you're aiming at, because all the journals have different requirements. I'll talk about that in the second section. So you'll have a clear idea of what you want to present and how you want to present it, and it will get better with each draft. The fourth part is the discussion, and I think the discussion is often best to the end, left to the end. The discussion should be interesting. It shouldn't just be a regurgitation of the same stuff again. It probably needs to start with some general statement, and sometimes it's good to repeat the main messages of your paper at the beginning of the discussion and at the end of the discussion. But really the discussion puts the research that you've done in the context of our current understanding. So the introduction set out the current understanding. The discussion puts your results in the context of the current understanding. That means basically it says why you have done what you've done, why is it good, why is it worth listening to, why is it important, what does it change, if anything, what does it contribute to the scientific and medical literature, how is it going to help people, what benefits it might confer, and so on. So this is really to bring out the importance of the work that you've done and put it in the context of everything else that is known. In the discussion, the final paragraph is the most important. That is a sort of wrap-up paragraph. It doesn't say exactly the same as the abstract. It really says what the main conclusions of your work are. Now again, there is often a limit in space. Discussions can be rather boring and rambling. They need to be edited on many times. After the discussion, there's often a small section, but it's quite an important section, called acknowledgements. And in that section you will describe who helped with the paper, but the ones who are not authors, who were critical in being able to do that study, and you may need at that point to acknowledge the funders. Notice I haven't mentioned yet authorship. Perhaps I'll talk about that now. Authorship is clearly important and therefore often a point of disagreement. And it's not uncommon for people to fight each other and friendships to be broken over authorship. So to try and avoid that, it's really good to have an agreement about who is going to be which author in which position at the beginning of the study, not at the end of the study. Now things can change, but the earlier you make an agreement on authorship, the more smooth it's going to be during and after the publication of the paper. So it's a very important decision. The first author is the person who gets the most credit for your paper. In general, the first author should be the person that designed the study and wrote the first draft of the paper. This is the person who will get the most credit, but also the most blame if the paper is not good. So that is the most responsible position. The last author, by tradition, is the senior person in the study. Sometimes it's the head of the research group or head of department. It should not be a position for a senior passenger, somebody who did nothing but is very important. That is something that the scientific community discourages. It has been common in the past, but every author on your paper should be somebody who has contributed something useful to the preparations, conduct, and analysis and communication of your work. So everybody has to contribute because everybody is responsible. So the last author is a very important position too. Sometimes a very senior person who is involved but maybe not the head of the group, maybe the head of the department or something like that, may come as second to last author. And at the front end, the sequence is usually the first author is the person that did the most work, the second author did the second, and so on. Sometimes there's a disagreement or an agreement of equality, and a few papers will have a little line at the bottom saying that the first and second authors contributed equally. Why is this authorship business so controversial? Well, it's because if you are a scientist or working in research in the university sphere, and even to some extent in industry, but particularly in academia, then your career and the success of your career is judged in part by the number of publications that you have and the quality of those publications. This is not to undervalue the extreme importance of teaching, of other work within the university setting, administration and so on, but in academia, research is highly valued. And the way we are judged these days is to a large extent on our papers, and you probably won't be able to read this, but the way we're judged now is a thing called the Hirsch index, or H index for short. This is basically the number of publications which have been cited that number of times. There's a formula here, you probably can't read it, but let's say I have written 50 papers which have been cited 50 times, then my Hirsch index is 50. And in general, this is a very good predictor of academic success. Nobel Prize winners tend to have Hirsch index over 80. I'm not sure which of you, I'm sure one of you will win a Nobel Prize. It also predicts entry into prestigious societies like the National Academy of Sciences or the Royal Society. And it's a simple measure. What it reflects, though, is how popular your area of science is. So some areas of science are very popular, they're very densely populated, cancer research, for example, theoretical physics, whereas our area of tropical medicine tends to be rather unpopulated. So there's not so much research going on in tropical medicine as in other areas, so the number of citations of our papers, which means the number of times that your paper is quoted in another paper, tends to be lower. So when comparing things like the H index between different areas, it's important to understand the field and how popular that field is. But again, it makes the point that it's not just writing a paper, it's writing a paper that's good. And I have to say, most papers in the end don't contribute very much. So let's hope that your paper is going to be an exception to that. Right, so we've got to the end of the manuscript and we're just writing the acknowledgements, and then there's the references, and I'll come back to the references when we discuss the journal. But in general, when an editor or a reviewer receives a paper, if it's nicely presented, well formatted, correctly compiled, and the references are all nice and neat, and it reads well, you're much likely to accept that paper. So although the scientific content is the most important thing, actually how it looks, how it feels, how it reads, they're important too. So get the references right. Now, let's go right back to the beginning, and there was that abstract. The abstract's the most important part of the paper, and it's probably best to write it at the end. But try and imagine that you know nothing about your field and you're reading your abstract for the first time. Would it be understandable? Would it be persuasive? Would it be something that you're interested in? Would you be able to have a take-home message from it? And so the writing of the abstract is something that you need to do many times. let's say you've written your first draft. That's really the most difficult part. It's really the most difficult part of it. And I know that people who've not written papers before or only written one or two find it very, very difficult to get that first draft done. They do anything rather than, they put it off, they find excuses not to do it because it's so difficult. And when you finished it, it looks like a mess. Don't worry about that. That's always what it looks like when it starts. Imagine you're a sculptor and you want to make a beautiful statue and you start with a large rock. Well, the first time you knock away the bits of rock to get the outline, it doesn't look anything like the final thing. So your first draft will probably be a bit of a mess. But it's really important to get that done. Once you've got a first draft, you then need to try to start refining it. And it depends a bit on your group and what subject you have, but in general the best thing is to keep circulating it amongst the team so that people put their comments in and try and refine it. It's not uncommon for a really good scientific or medical paper to have 10 drafts. That takes a long time. And time is important. So if you imagine the amount of time it's going to take from your first idea about the research to the final appearance in the public domain, either online or in a printed journal, it's quite a long time. It's not uncommon for research to take 2 or 3 years. A PhD nowadays, typically 3, could be 4 years. So if you wrote up the work in the last year of your PhD, let's say the 3rd or the 4th year, it's going to take several months probably to get these versions into a shape where you are really happy to submit to the journal. So you can imagine that if it takes 10 iterations, each iteration might take a week. It could take 2.5 months to go from first draft to submission. In my experience, it can take much longer than that. So there's a big delay. Even when you've submitted, it's going to take a long time. So let's imagine you've gone through all these drafts, you've got something that you really feel is okay, your group are happy with it, your head of department's happy with it, preferably you've sent it to some other people who are your friends but not involved directly, and they've given you some advice about it, and you're happy to submit. What happens next? Well, at some point in that, early on, hopefully, you've chosen your journal, and that's the next section of the talk. But let's say you chose the journal. Very important, you download the instructions to authors. So the instructions to authors says exactly how the journal wants the paper to appear. It gives you the precise details of how long, what sections, how to organize it, and so on. Some journals, for example, have the methods after the results and discussion. So you've got to read it, and also the journals have specific recommendations about references, about exactly what style of references. And be careful about references, because often the programs such as RefMan or EndNote can make a mistake or give you the wrong style. So be very careful about the references. And the formatting is really important. Get it right. Check it's right. Let's assume you've done all that. You've got a paper, it's a final draft, it's in the right format, it's been checked, everybody's happy. Now the terrifying prospect of submitting. Usually nowadays you submit online. That in itself can take many hours. It's quite a complicated process, but let's say you were successful. What happens then is that the journal will receive it, they will send you usually an electronic, or nowadays almost always an email to say they got it. Quite soon afterwards, it's not uncommon for the production editor to go straight back to you and say, thanks for submitting the paper, but the figures are in the wrong format, or you didn't do this, or you didn't do that. So you've got to do it again. Usually that fix doesn't take very long. Send it back. And then there is silence. Now, the longer the silence goes on, actually the better. A very quick reply usually means, no thanks, we've had a quick look, the editorial board or the editor themselves has had a look and said, no, that's not for our journal. You you have to now send somewhere else. The longer the wait, the better the news, because that probably means that the journal has sent your paper out to referee. And the referees, and there might be some of you out there, but referees, I referee lots of papers. I try and do it quickly, but I have to say some people are really slow. They can take months, and that's holding up your paper, so that's a problem. Anyway, once those referees' reports are back, the editor makes a decision, sends it out to you. There are only a limited number of options. One, easy, is reject. Thanks, but no thanks. We've seen your paper, it's been reviewed by the referees, here's what they say, they didn't like it, send somewhere else. The other end, fine, please, that's it, accept, almost never happens. I've only had it happen to me twice. It almost never happens. So don't be disappointed if it doesn't say, thanks, we'll take your paper straight away. It usually says, the best you can get is, thank you for submitting your paper. It is not acceptable in its present form, but if you adjust or change or respond to the referee's comments, then it may be acceptable. That is the best you'll get. Sometimes they're pretty tough and say, look, we're not sure about this. The referees had some major objections to your paper. We'll take another look, but no promises. So I'm just going to speak briefly now in the other two sections, how to select your journal. Well, there are many journals, as you know. In fact, the number of journals has been increasing exponentially, and in my opinion now there are probably too many journals. Most of them are of poor quality, the new ones, and many of them are simply ways for publishers to get profit.